And yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on such a gorgeous day. You're very good to not all just be out in the garden. I'm just going to have a go at sharing my screen. Here we go. Hopefully you can all see that. There we go. Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Right. So Henry Scott Tuke was both an artist and an avid sailor. And over the course of his career, he found ways to integrate these two interests in the pursuit of new and experimental ways of creating art out on the water. Boats were much more than just mere accessories in his pictures. They were much more than just props. As we'll explore during the course of this morning, they also provided really unique platforms for painting, enabling Tuke to mobilize his art practice and access otherwise inaccessible vistas. Right. Tuke spent the summer of 1882 at Torcross down in Devon, holidaying with some friends that he'd made while studying at the Slade School of Art, which he attended from 1875 to 1880. He was with fellow artists George Jacob Hood, Joseph Benwell Clark, and Albert Chevalier Taylor. And together they spent several months sketching and messing about in fishing boats. And as Jacob Hood later recalled, they were living a simple and semi-amphibious life, and Tuke soon became as much enamored of the sea and a boat as myself. Now, this passion for the sea and sailing would go on to become central to Tuke's life and art going forwards. Surviving diary extracts make regular reference to the early morning bathes or the fishing trips and the yacht racing that punctuated his day-to-day life. Increasingly, one of Tuke's primary motivations for messing about in boats becomes artistic, and throughout his career, he dedicates much of his time to painting afloat in search of new ways to take the practice of painting outdoors, of painting on plein air, out onto the water. And Tuke's interest in plein air painting stems from his time spent in Italy and France in the early 1880s. Having finished studying at Slade, he set off for Italy in 1881. He was supposed to be studying the Italian Old Masters at the Uffizi, but he quickly gets bored of copying pictures. And as Kenneth McConkie explores in his chapter in the book, and he may have touched on this in his talk earlier in this series, Tuke meets the British painter Arthur Lemon when he's out in Florence, and that is a really big turning point for his art. Lemon is the one to introduce Tuke to painting outdoors. He takes him to Pietrasanta on the Tuscany coast, and he teaches him how to paint en plein air, how to observe his subjects and paint quickly in order to capture the atmospheric effects of sunlight and shade. And this interest in outdoor painting was consolidated when Tuke then studies in Paris in 1882. It's while he's studying at the atelier of Jean-Paul Laronde that Tuke visits the studio of Bastien Lepage, and he describes seeing many things of surpassing beauty. He's also in Paris for the 1882 Salon exhibition at the Académie des Beaux-Arts, and this is where a new fashion for plein air naturalism is really being showcased by a number of emerging British artists. So that includes Tuke's Slade friend Thomas Cooper Gotch, who was exhibiting alongside artists like William Stott of Oldham and Alexander Harrison. Together, this group of artists and their fresh approach to outdoor painting and coastal subjects would have a really lasting impression on the young Tuke. Now, on his return from France and Italy, it's perhaps unsurprising that Tuke was fueled by this passion to be an en plein air painter. And on the trip to Torcross in 82, he embarked on a large canvas painted in the open air on the hillside above the town. And the finished composition is now untraced. So this is the only study that remains of what was a sizable and ambitious composition. While working on this painting, Tuke was introduced to the environmental challenges that confront the plein air painter, especially when you choose to paint on a Devonshire hillside as opposed to a beautiful sunny Tuscan beach. Tuke writes home describing how the difficulties of coping with the monster canvas in the wind and sun are immense. I'm generally surrounded by a willing band of gamins, which is sort of derogatory slang for the local boys that were helping him, and they're ready to run for sticks or ropes as required. Now, when Tuke then subsequently moves to working on plein air out on the water, these environmental complications would be significantly magnified. And while he'd continue to recruit local boys, gamins, or key scamps as he called them, he would use them as models and crew, but sticks and ropes would no longer offer a suitable or sufficient solution. Now, as this satirical sketch by Stanhope Forbes rather effectively illustrates, in a strong wind, a canvas functioned much better as a sail than as a primed surface for painting. Now, out on the water, a host of other variables also threatened to disrupt the traditionally fixed position of both the artist and their chosen subject. As the journalist M.H. Freeman explains in an article called A Seagoing Studio, and this was published in the Art Journal in 1893. Once embarked on the sea, a crowd of difficulties leap to greet one. Try and paint your view of a town from a boat. The variation of the point of sight when your boat rises with the flood or sinks with the ebb tide will convince you that tides are a wholly unnecessary and irritating invention. Then, unless you're moored stem and stern with great accuracy, and the tides have a voice in this too, you will find yourself veering round with every shift in the wind. Now, Freeman also describes the challenging optics that were encountered by the marine painter Charles Napier Hemy, who, having moved to Falmouth in Cornwall in 1881, initially worked from a small rowing boat, which we're told had a white umbrella and canvas firmly lashed. But alas, the sun shining down upon the water produced a fierce reflection, and with the rising wind, the boat would pitch so as to render work almost impossible just when the sea became most interesting. Now, Tuke actually encountered the opposite issue, being interrupted every few minutes by clouds or rain. And in fact, like many of his contemporaries, he even on occasion fell foul of the dreaded mal de mer, complaining of seasickness after an hour and a half in a good easterly roll. But despite the evident challenges posed by this environment, Tuke continued to persevere, stating in the Windsor magazine that for my sea pictures, I definitely prefer to be on a boat. Offering an otherwise unmatched set of compositional, aesthetic, and optical conditions, painting en plein air on water was a way of working that Tuke was determined to pursue. And in 1883, Tuke sets his sights on coastal Cornwall, staying in the first instance in the small fishing village of Newlyn before settling in Falmouth in 1885. And while at Newlyn, in true colony fashion, Tuke sought to do more than just observe his fisherfolk subjects. He sought out opportunities to gain real sea experience and even went deep sea fishing with his Newlyn landlord, Philip Harvey, who you can see here. Now, Tuke also borrowed boats from Harvey, which he used both as props and as platforms for painting. Here you can see Tuke lounging across the front of the Ripple, which was a small fishing boat measuring 26 foot long and 8 foot wide. And it's from this vessel, described as a sturdy craft of satisfying dimensions, that Tuke painted Summertime in 1885. Now, this work is lost, but thankfully a photo of it has been pasted into the Register of Paintings. It depicts two Newlyn-based boys, John Ruffinack Cotton and John Wesley Kitching. Depicting the latter stripped to the waist, this composition was described as Tuke's first open-air nude. The boys are seated within Little Argo, which was another small boat also owned by Harvey. And Tuke records in his register that the painting is created from the Ripple and the beach at Newlyn. So as such, this is arguably an early example of Tuke experimenting with what we might describe as semi-amphibious art practice. Situating the viewer in the shared space of the vessel as if we're seated in the front of the boat, this distinctive cropped composition would become quite a characteristic feature of Tuke's early maritime genre pictures. As the painting is now untraced, and art critics comment about the vivid scheme of blue sea, sky, and boat, it's all that remains to suggest that Tuke was moving toward a bright, sun-filled palette with this painting. Now, following the move to Falmouth, having developed an evident interest in both boating and painting afloat, Tuke begins to amass his own fleet of vessels, and he gradually acquires rowing boats, traditional Falmouth key punts, racing yachts, and even bespoke floating studios. And fortunately for us, Tuke kept a meticulous record of the works that he was creating in this register of paintings, which is now in the Tate Archive. And within this, not only does Tuke record where works are painted, who the models are, which galleries he's exhibiting them with, and for how much they're being sold for, he also records the different vessels involved, detailing whether works were done with lily, located in the Julie's rigging, or painted out on my quay punt. And this sort of description is really evident in the 1880s and early 1890s, which I think at the very least suggests that this is when Tuke is particularly interested in the novelty of this practice. And then as Tuke moves to paint more resolved compositions afloat, as his register records, his ever-evolving flotilla would both feature in and facilitate his painting. Now, before we look more specifically at this, sorry, just a random photo of Tuke sailing, it's just lovely. Now, before we talk more about Tuke's own practice, I'm going to take us on a bit of a tangent in order to put Tuke and his semi-amphibious art practice in context. And, oh, my screen's frozen. So within the history of British art, from William van der Velde the Elder drawing naval battles in the Anglo-Dutch Wars through to Turner wrestling with turbulent waters at the opening of the Thames, there's a really long established tradition of artists going afloat to make in situ studies of water, waves, and warships. However, in the later 19th century, as the fashion for painting en plein air develops, a growing number of artists begin to seek ways to paint more resolved compositions afloat. And in an attempt to overcome the specific environmental challenges of their surroundings, they search for ways to adapt vessels to suit their needs. And it's really with this that the phenomenon of the bespoke floating studio is born. The earliest known examples of floating studios actually emerge on the other side of the channel. Charles-François Daubigné launched his first bateau atelier, nicknamed Le Bottin, the Little Box, in September 1857. Daubigné rather helpfully created a set of engravings that depict a voyage on his floating studio. As you can see here, he's converted a small vessel, 28 foot long, which was originally built as a ferry, and he converted it to provide basic living quarters, a bit of storage space, and crucially, somewhere to paint undercover. And with the cabin built directly level with the waterline, as Michael Clark has explained, it provided this wonderful low viewpoint out onto the river, enabling Daubigné to explore northern France, traveling for a number of days at a time. Now, strongly influenced by Daubigné's example in 1873, Claude Monet commissioned a studio boat to facilitate his study of sunlight on water along the River Seine at Argenteuil. And now this studio boat was depicted on several occasions, both by Monet himself, but also here by Edouard Manet. The craft was adapted from a houseboat rather than a ferry, but much like Daubigné's earlier design, it was a shallow-bottomed rowing boat, and that crucially allowed the artist to explore the full scope of the river while protected from the elements. And here you can see Monet enjoying a sunny day under the sort of shade of his canopy. Now, much like Daubigné before him, this small floating studio was level with the waterline, and it enabled Monet to create those midstream compositions that become so iconic of his depictions of Argenteuil. Now, what I'm particularly interested in is how this fashion for floating studios subsequently takes off on this side of the channel. Because in the 1880s and 1890s, numerous eccentric-looking hybrid vessels start to pop up along Britain's rivers and coastline. In some instances, artists find relatively impromptu solutions. For example, Tuke's Falmouth marine painting contemporary William A.S. Ingram arranged a sort of swinging seat in the bottom of his yacht, while the sea painter Henry Moore erected what he described as a weather cloth, which was basically a sheet that he would put up and duck behind if a wave swept across the vessel. And it wasn't all marine painters. John Singer Sargent reportedly built himself a little floating studio on a punt when he was working along the Thames in the summer of 1887, but Sargent in particular may well have been directly inspired by Monet, having visited him at Giverny on several occasions in the later 1880s. Now, other artists start to pursue much more substantial solutions, retrofitting existing vessels to create more stable, permanent, and quite frankly, comfortable platforms for painting. Unfortunately, perhaps due to their really rather weird and wonderful design, floating studios seem to catch the attention of the contemporary press. So there are a number of really invaluable visual and literary descriptions of their design and use. For example, the Windsor magazine ran a feature on the Four Brothers, which was built from a Thames barge, and the marine artist William Morrison Wiley converted it to facilitate his coastal painting in and around the Medway. And apologies, the images, the illustrations for this article are appalling, but I'm going to try and work through them anyway. As the journalist Fred Dolman reported, it was built with a studio above the saloon with a plate glass lookout that you can just about see in this photo, popping up through the deck. This enabled Wiley to survey all points of the sea and sky, while crucially, we're told, protected from the wind and rain and the most violent pitching and rolling. But it gets more bizarre because underneath in the saloon, Wiley also had a fixed easel. And as the journalist describes, he set up telescopes in each of the portholes on either side of the boat to enable him to extend his observation to considerable distances. And again, it's a terrible image, but you can see the telescope just behind his head here in this photo. And it was really with this ingenious dual studio setup that Wiley would set off for a couple of weeks at a time, cruising down the channel and around the coast. Now, the Magazine of Art published a 6-page feature on the unusual construction of a boat called the Thetis, which we're told was not simply a pleasure craft, but a painter's working houseboat. It was designed for an artist skipper who remains unnamed throughout the article. And the vessel was repurposed from an ordinary cutter without cabins, which we're told was therefore of little use for painting purposes. This is presumably because of the lack of shelter and the fact that it had no storage. The journalist provides a rather lengthy report of a seemingly radical conversion process. In the first place, she, the boat, was cut into halves from stem to stern, and the two halves being then completed and separated by a platform and her waterline, leaving an uninterrupted channel between two half hulls. This resulted in an innovative duplex principle, as the journalist reports, with a large studio cabin measuring 13 feet wide and 20 foot long on the platform between the two hulls of this catamaran-like structure. It resulted in an exceedingly odd-looking design, so it's perhaps unsurprising that it was described as a source of curiosity and bewilderment. Much like a traditional artist studio, you can see a considerable length of window along the side. Inside, it was fitted out with racks for stowing away canvases and the like. And with this unusual structure, it didn't need a keel, so it was very stable and could also sail about in shallow water. And this enabled the artist to carry on painting even at low tide. As these illustrations demonstrate, the Thetis was also rather well furnished. You even have a fresh vase of flowers on the right-hand side, which seems slightly likely to fall over in anything of a breeze. On the right, you also have this rather stereotyped image of the unnamed artist skipper, who is both wearing his captain's hat and clutching a brush or a pencil as he looks out of the window, which I think is very reminiscent of some of the photos of Tuke in a similar sort of costume. Now, the experiments of another of Tuke's Falmouth-based contemporaries, the marine painter Charles Napier Hemy, caught the attention of the Art Journal. After his rather unsuccessful attempts to work from a rowing boat, he created this pioneer studio, which is how it's described by the journalist. It's converted from a 40-foot-long fishing boat, and following extensive renovations, the vessel was renamed as the Van der Velde in homage of the 17th century Dutch artist who was traditionally seen as the father of marine painting. Now, in theory, you would think this inherently wide boat was entirely appropriate for the construction of a floating studio. It was positioned with this cabin on the waterline, again providing that all-important water level aspect. And with 7 foot of clearance, the cabin was easily big enough for the artist to work on canvas undercover. But the Van der Velde was not a wholly successful experiment. Its rather top-heavy design made the boat very unstable, and as the Art Journal reported, in spite of 3 tons of granite ballast, she rolled most fearfully in anything of a swell. So having developed and worked from this prototype Van der Velde for a number of years, Hemi would go on to develop the Van der Meer. And this far more ambitious seafaring studio boat would have a direct influence on Henry Scott Tuke and his forays into floating studio design, which will now very much become the focus, my focus for the remainder of this paper. I'm going to start by talking about the Julie of Nantes, because in June 1886, shortly after moving to Falmouth, Tuke purchased the Julie, which was a derelict French brigantine that had been decommissioned by the French Navy. He set about converting this rather sizable hulk into a usable studio, installing a glass skylight over the main hatch and a floor along the entirety of the hold, which created a 60-foot studio and living space. Holes were cut into either side of the boat to create a window and a door. And in this photo, there are 2 men posing on the foredeck and up in the rigging, one of which may well be Tuke, and together they thoroughly provide an indication of the scale of this rather wonderfully eccentric enterprise. Moored off Greenbank in Falmouth Harbour, this floating colossus provided a stable stationary platform from which to observe the surrounding harbour. But it was by no means intended to mobilise the artist. Instead, I think the Julie is a much more direct alternative to the land-based studio home that had become such a familiar feature, especially in metropolitan areas by the 1880s. As Tuke's friend, the journalist Charles Keynes Jackson recorded, on board this beautiful, if somewhat leaky old vessel, Tuke lived and worked for 2 or 3 years. Tuke even received mail addressed to him at the brigantine Julie. But more than merely a floating outpost, it really was a fully functioning studio. As his sister recalls, all sorts of small gaieties and much sailing went along with the production of many pictures. The 2 or 3 large ones each year, portraits, studies of heads, the rapid sketches of sailing ships, and various small subjects. The register also confirms the variety of works that were being produced aboard, not just over the warm summer months, but even over the course of the autumn and winter, when it seems surprising but Tuke continued to live aboard. Much like its land-based equivalent, the Julie really provided a space for Tuke's public and private spheres to intersect. Between 1886 and 1892, it was a hub of artistic and social activity, with clients attending formal sittings, models posing in all parts of the ship, and friends and artist contemporaries regularly visiting the artist aboard. Now, as this image on the left indicates, the openings cut into the side of the hull as the window and door also simultaneously provided that much sought after water level perspective. The first boat in, which is the image on the right, is recorded in the register as being painted from the Julie, and I think it was most likely created from this aspect. The original oil painting was destroyed, but again, thankfully, a reproduction was published in the Strand magazine, and it's copied into the Register of Paintings. Once again, Tuke situates us as the viewer in the front of the boat. So it's again deploying this very heavily cropped composition. And he's almost certainly used one of his own boats in order to stage this. The small sailing boat resembles the 12-foot little punt that Tuke acquired following his move to Falmouth, which David Crabb has explained in his very detailed study of Tuke's boats. The mast of this small dinghy could easily be removed, and the distinctive tan-coloured sails can often be identified lying in the bottom of the boat, which again, you see him using the same boat as a model in The Fisherman, again, which is on display in the current exhibition. Now, the dramatic cropped composition, sorry, my slides have just frozen. There we go. The dramatic cropped composition, this sort of tremendous foreshortening and the boat-based staging of this scene all reflect compositional precedents best established by Tissot in the 1870s. Now, in fact, Portsmouth Harbour, this work here, was exhibited at the opening exhibition of the Grosvenor Gallery in 1877, which we know Tuke attended while studying at the Slade. The first boat in is perhaps a more ambitious and complex composition, if it was indeed painted from the Julie. Now, Tuke chose to debut this experimental work at the Avant-Garde New English Art Club before it was exhibited more widely in Nottingham and Plymouth. Now, as well as being used as a platform for painting, the brigantine also functioned as a stage, providing a backdrop for a number of Tuke's significant maritime genre pictures painted in the 1880s. The evident theatricality of this setting is conveyed within the register, where Tuke makes regular reference to the different portions of the ship that he's using as a backdrop for his paintings. But it was on the deck of the Julie that Tuke staged one of his most successful works, All Hands to the Pump. While the interior of the brigantine had been converted into this gallery/living space, the deck and rigging were left untouched. And here in this photo of Tuke on the deck alongside Falmouth models Jack Rowling and Jim Diamond, you can really see the extent to which the remaining workings of the vessel had been left in situ. With its sails already sort of in tatters, the deteriorating brigantine provided a curiously appropriate model for a ship in its final moments of distress. The composition was informed by Tuke's own experience of staying aboard during a particularly violent storm. As he described, he was awakened one night by a tearing gale. I went up to see that all was secure, and there in the lashing rain and roaring wind, the idea occurred to me, which fructified in that picture. And the resulting work is this very dramatic depiction of a ship being swamped in a storm. The crew strained to operate the bilge pump in a desperate attempt to keep the vessel afloat. Painted in dark, somber colours, the palette very much suggests the ongoing influence of the Newland School on Tuke at this time. But he has featured local Falmouth residents rather than professional models. So these are real muscular bodies, ruddy faces, beards, tattoos, worn out oilskins. And this was something that Tuke would then continue to do throughout his career, often preferring real people in the quest for apparent authenticity. Now, within the register, Tuke records that the work was painted on the deck from September 1808 to March 1809. It seems extremely unlikely that the work was entirely painted in situ, especially given both the presumed adverse weather over the winter months and the size of this work, which is 6 foot high and 4.5 foot wide. But whether or not the work was actually finished on the deck of the Julie, there was an evident desire for Tuke to present the process of painting aboard as this act of endurance. As he later explained in an interview, I painted at times when I had literally to hold on by the rotten shrouds with one hand while I steadied my easel and painted with the other. And the models shriveled up and turned blue with the cold. So Tuke, he appears to willingly sacrifice his own safety and that of his models in this quest to capture the enormity of the action. And in fact, I think this is very reminiscent of the probably mythical story of Turner strapping himself to the mast in a snowstorm in the quest for the perfect composition. Tuke, similarly, I think, presents himself as battling against the elements in the pursuit of an experiential and perhaps even marginally perilous mode of artistic production afloat. Now, All Hands to the Pump was a resounding success. It was hung on the line at the Royal Academy in 1889, and it was purchased subsequently by the Chantry Fund for the considerable sum of £420. So this picture really firmly establishes Tuke as a contender in the British art world at the time. In elevating the everyday subject of a ship in the storm to this sort of epic heights of history painting, the work was praised in the graphic as the strongest we have seen by him. Now, Tuke lived aboard the Julie. Tuke lived aboard the Julie on and off between 1886 and 1892. And his sister recalls painting, photography, and tea parties on boards over 2 glorious summers. Stanhope Forbes similarly recollected partaking in a wonderful tea, seems to be a lot of afternoon tea going on, under stranger conditions than I've ever taken that meal before. And by the 1890s, the brigantine was in such a state of disrepair that by 1892, Tuke reported that the poor old Julie has left my hands at last. And Tuke relocates to his cottage, where he then has his main studio going forward. And the Julie was laid up along the banks of the Penryn River. As his sister later recalled, some remains of her hull were visible for a long time after, reluctantly decaying after her rather famous and dignified old age. Now, despite the relatively brief period in which the Julie is used and lived in, this rather massive example of a floating studio is regularly referenced in articles about the artist for years to come. In fact, as a result, the Julie plays a key part in the construction of Tuke's artistic persona as this rather eccentric and mildly reclusive artist mariner. Now, while living and working on the incredibly stable, if rather immobile brigantine, Tuke continued to use a number of smaller and more agile vessels to paint some of his major compositions. And the register records that the small oil painting R. Jack on the left-hand side was done with Lily, a sailing boat that Tuke acquired in the same year, 1886. It was one of a number of works to be painted aboard, and as such, R. Jack provides essential evidence of the size and the design of the vessel. Rowling is depicted up by the bow, standing in the deep cockpit of this traditional Falmouth key punt, which was a working boat made in Falmouth and often used in the later 19th century, as opposed to the sort of the punt you might use to go and have afternoon tea along the Cam. Now, we know from the diaries that Tuke initially uses the Lily to go racing and painting, but in 1888 he acquires the Cornish Girl, and it's with this larger, more powerful key punt that Lily is really usurped as a platform for painting. And it's aboard this new boat, the Cornish Girl, that Tuke paints the bathers that you can see on the right-hand side in the same year that he's acquired the boat itself. Now, painted just 2 years apart, the two works are strikingly similar in some respects in terms of composition. In both cases, the viewer and artist is positioned at the back of the boat, looking forwards towards the model or models who are situated on or beside the bow. The mast provides this incredibly strong vertical access down the right-hand side, and the intricacies of the ropes and rigging and sails, etc., are all depicted in painstaking detail, very much conveying Tuke's familiarity and fascination with the inner workings of these newly acquired small boats. There is, of course, a very crucial difference. Painted in muted shades, R. Jack is a mix of portrait picture and maritime subject, whereas the Bathers, which is painted in this vibrant sunlit palette, is an early example of Tuke experimenting with painting the academic male nude. By the time Tuke painted the latter work, this approach to painting a subject from within the same boat was clearly a well-practiced mode of production. But of course, the Bathers is unusual in being a nude subject. Exhibited at the New English Art Club in 1889, before being acquired by Leeds Art Gallery the following year, the Bathers was seen as a great success. The Illustrated London News praised the painting as a successful work full of sunlight and healthy feeling, and the London Evening Standard commended the work as happily charged with the keenness and the vibration of open-air light. Despite the success of this work, however, this was not a compositional format that Tuke would repeat in subsequent depictions of the nude form. Perhaps in situating the viewer within the shared space of the vessel, Tuke positions them or us in startling, even perhaps uncomfortable proximity to the painted nude figures. Later works tend to provide a greater sort of spatial separation, which on one level could be understood as an attempt to create a sort of respectable distance between the viewer and the subject. However, as the contemporary criticism demonstrates, the Bathers was well received as an example of idealized academic healthy painting, its acceptability being further confirmed by its swift entry into a public art collection. So in order to understand why Tuke moved away from this established and clearly successful method of production and the rather compressed composition that it results in, I think we need to put this in the context of his developing aesthetic interests. As he later explained in Pearson's magazine, it interests me more than anything else in life, the play of outdoor light and sunshine on the human form. Now in the bathers, the bodies of the bathing boys are brightly lit by direct sunlight, an effect that's conveyed through the smooth application of large areas of monotone pale pigment. A pair of hands on the port side gunwale, the left edge of the boat, alludes to the presence of the fourth bathing figure, but this cropped composition denies the viewer any further interaction with them or their water-based surroundings. So in order to explore that greater chromatic potential of interactions between sunlight, water, and the human form, Tuke needs to create greater separation. And I think it's that desire to try out alternative modes of staging his male nude compositions that perhaps informs the design of his second floating studio. Now, following the demise of the Julie, Tuke doesn't replace the brigantine with a ship of similar proportions, and instead he opts to commission something far more agile. He acquires an old yacht in the autumn of 1892, and that undergoes substantial renovations to become a functioning floating studio. Tuke doesn't name the new boat, but its rather distinctive top-heavy design leads the local fishermen to refer to it as the pie box. Unlike other vessels within Tuke's fleet, this second studio boat doesn't feature in any of his paintings, which in itself suggests something about how he's changed how he's working from this boat. And there are no photographic records of the pie box either. So without these pictorial clues, it's really difficult to determine its size or its design. But fortunately, Tuke's sister records that it was done in the manner of Napier Hemming's studio boat, the Vandermeer. So coming back to Hemi at this point, because fortunately, the art journal provides that very lengthy description of the Vandermeer, which was built in an attempt to create a faster, more seaworthy alternative to the unstable Van der Velde. Like the pie box, it was similarly constructed on the hull and lead keel of an existing yacht. And a large studio cabin was located on the deck, which you can see here. This was described as amply large enough to paint an 8-foot picture. Tuke's pie box was reportedly slightly smaller, with a glass-roofed deck. It apparently sailed as splendidly as if it were not contrived to do a double duty. And it was in the pie box that Tuke would rush out to the Manacles, which is the navigational marker right at the entrance to Falmouth Harbour, where he would paint the latest arrival of square riggers. As his sister recalled, this was a very practical floating studio, and Tuke could catch all the lovely barks that came in and out of the harbour. So crucially, compared to the Julie, the pie box could move. It was a fast boat for sailing around in. Despite the differing artistic interests of Hemi and Tuke, parallels can be drawn between their working practices afloat. We're provided with a very detailed description of how Hemi worked from the Vandermeer. In the harbour, she is moored stem and stern. Then, standing at the window, Mr. Hemi directs the posing of the model boat, which is also carefully moored. And the accompanying illustration depicts Hemi, pallet and mahlstick in hand, directing the positioning of a smaller boat, which you can see here is being positioned at a distance away from the moored up Vandermeer. As Freeman outlines, posing the so-called model boat in this way provided a unique opportunity to study atmospheric effects over a prolonged period of time. And this is a study that's in the Ashmolean collection by Hemi. Well, excuse me, to quote, "By this means, Hemi can study those wonderful green depths beneath the shadow of the boat and watch the play of the water as it breaks against her sides. Each hour reveals some new fact of form or light or colour." Now, the way in which Hemi worked from his floating studio offers us with some insights into how Tuke may have similarly staged his paintings. And I'm going to make particular reference to one of his major successes, August Blue, which was created in the deep water out by Pendennis Castle. So having been painted from this new floating studio, Tuke positioned the buoys and the rowing boat at a distance, much like Hemi, and this has enabled him to capture changing light and colour. Observing the scene from a distance, Tuke is able to explore all those interactions between the sunshine, the water, and the bathing model in all its variations. Situated right at the centre of the composition, the partially submerged bathing figure holding onto the gun or the side of the boat is reminiscent of that unseen buoy in the bathers. However, now depicted at a distance, this representation of the nude form and its watery surroundings can be realised in full. Facing away from the viewer, his exposed back is brightly lit, both by direct sunlight and the light bouncing back off the water. This is contrasted with the cool blue tones of submerged limbs, which gradually disappear, refracted into the increasingly opaque depths below. The model's pale skin tones are then reiterated and transformed in the reflections across the water, which even on a calm day is slightly animated by the prevailing wind. The unusual staging of this work allowed Tuke to explore all of these aesthetic effects to the full. And when the work was exhibited at the Royal Academy, it was praised for the superb translation of sunlight over blue sea. August Blue was a notable success. Again, it was purchased by the Chantry Fund, this time for the even greater sum of £525. And yet, again, Tuke, perhaps curiously, doesn't repeat this type of composition when staging his nude subjects. In fact, it would seem that adapting Hemi's methods of artistic production to further the study of the male nude was not without its complications. Because, of course, it involves posing models rather than just boats, the ice-cold waters of the Atlantic were a bit of an issue. And in fact, this was such an act of endurance that Tuke had to have two sets of buoys. And he explains that when one set got perished with the cold, they were relieved, which is reassuring. Now, the exposed location in which this work was staged was also perhaps problematic in the context of attitudes to public nudity, because even as early as 1883, the Falmouth Packet paper was criticising the nude bathing by men and boys at all times of day near the landing place, gross outrages on decency. With the creation of August Blue, Tuke's models weren't just bathing in a public place, they were posing nude for hours at a time on a boat moored right in the midst of the busy harbour. So it's possible that these practical and societal considerations may have informed Tuke's next move, because despite the success of August Blue and the evident advantages to this method of staging a composition, Tuke makes a distinctive decision to relocate to the shallow waters and sheltered beaches near his clifftop cottage. And from the later 1890s onwards, Tuke situates the majority of his nude subjects in the sheltered environs of Newporth Beach, Sunny Cove, and a thin strip of sand underneath his cottage, which became known locally as Tuke's Beach. Now, while his models continue to appear messing about in Tuke's own fleet of smaller boats, the artist himself appears to become a bit more land-based, and there are quite a number of photos like this that depict him with his easel and his paint pots firmly located on the beach. Now, this decision to relocate to a more sheltered shoreline was presumably a rather welcome change for his models, but it also provided a much less conspicuous setting for a nude bathing scene. Despite the gradual introduction of swimwear in the later 19th century, nude sea swimming among single-sex groups, especially men, did continue well into the early 20th century, in fact, but increasingly this tended to take place in more secluded places, out of sight of the public landing base, the pier, the promenade, that sort of thing. Now, Tuke's move to the shallows can also be explored again as a deliberate aesthetic decision, driven by a desire to study the emerald green shallows that becomes such a characteristic feature of his late works. Painted on Newporth Beach during the summer of 1902, Ruby Gold Malachite demonstrates the wealth of tonal variations that could be achieved in these new surroundings. Using the nude body as a vehicle to transmit these light effects, the broad spectrum of flesh tones illustrates Tuke's increasing chromatism. Surrounding rocks and cliffs introduce a new effect as well, that of shadow, which is of course incredibly hard to come by out under the direct sun at sea. Now, when this work was exhibited at the Royal Academy the following year, the Eastern Daily Press commented on the variety of colour. A picture of boys bathing, flooded with beautiful light seen through a soft, warm atmosphere. Even in the shallow waters, while Tuke had abandoned the comfort, enhanced stability, and the shelter of his more formal floating studios, he seems determined to pursue the unique effects of working on water. He would turn to rowing boats and even on occasion fashion a raft made from logs in order to continue playing around with painting afloat. As one local model, Bobby Rowe, later recalled, even when his nude subjects were firmly located on the land, Tuke would go away in his boat when he had them arranged to paint them nude on the beach. So it would seem that in the search to perfect the art of working on water, this lifelong artist skipper would continue to seek out this slightly semi-amphibious approach to painting, positioning himself in contention with the elements in the quest to create his desired view of the nude male form. As Tuke himself would conclude, it has been worth the struggle with natural obstacles which beset the painter, changing lights, encroaching tides, and buffeting winds. There we go. Thank you very much. I'll stop my screen share.
Thank you very much, Cicely. That's a fantastic talk, which really nicely completes this talking about Tuke course. I just wanted to throw it open to anyone who might have any questions or anything that they want Cicely to retouch upon. Or has she just covered all bases? No? No? Okay. Well, in that case, Cicely, is there anything that you wanted to elaborate on, or?
Well, I suppose it would be interesting if just how the course has gone, really, for anyone that's been in. I hope all the different lectures have given you a kind of a broad overview of these different approaches to the exhibition and to the artist, and yeah, just want to plug that the show is still on until the 12th of September. So if you haven't already, there's still time to come and visit if you're able to get down to Compton.
And share all your newfound knowledge with anyone else who may be in the gallery with you at the same time. Perfect. Well, yeah, thank you everyone very much for coming today, and thank you for attending the course. I'm sure that Narissa will be in touch about the next course which we have when that's programmed, and we will circulate this recording along with all the rest for you to refer back to at any time. So thank you all very much. Do send us any feedback that you have or anything that might spring to mind later, and we'll get back to you on that. But now enjoy the sun.